After being publicly humiliated by my husband at an office dinner, I realized he had underestimated me in every way. What began as quiet resentment evolved into a patient, calculated plan, observing his arrogance, uncovering hidden weaknesses and subtly guiding colleagues and clients to see the cracks he could not hide. Each minor move I made set off ripples that escalated into major consequences, exposing his deceit, manipulation, and overconfidence. When the moment was right, I executed the final, silent reveal, turning humiliation into undeniable empowerment. By the end, I wasn't just vindicated, I had quietly reclaimed authority, reshaped the world around me, and emerged stronger, wiser, and in full control. I remember the first time I felt invisible in my own life. It wasn't a single moment, it was 100 tiny omissions. The way my voice would trail off in conversations, the way my opinions were laughed at or ignored. It had become normal, like breathing, like the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. I thought I was living a life of quiet acceptance. Until that night, the office dinner, North Carolina's crisp autumn air brushing against the city streets, as if the wind itself were holding its breath. I'd spent hours choosing the right outfit, something understated but sharp, professional but elegant. I wanted him to see me, to notice me, not like he ever did. But I had a feeling, even before the evening began, that tonight would feel different. He was there before me. My husband, James, leaned casually against the bar, drink in hand, chatting with colleagues I barely knew. He looked satisfied, like he owned the room. And maybe he did. That night, the world belonged to him, or so he thought. As I approached, he caught my eye. His smile faltered, but only slightly. He didn't expect me to notice the way he scrutinized me, as if I were a piece of furniture in his carefully curated life. And I let him think that. Dinner started. Conversations droned on, executives talking numbers, promotions, the subtle flex of power. I stayed quiet. Perfectly still, observing, noticing the way he laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. Noticing the way he reached for his wine glass with a flick of arrogance, as if to assert dominance over the very air I breathed. Then it happened. The moment that would haunt me, replaying in slow motion for months to come. "Clara," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "don't be such a pig. Can't you control yourself?" The word cut through me. Like glass. Like a blade. I froze. The chatter around us didn't falter. People laughed nervously. I could feel every eye on me, yet no one spoke up, no one stopped him. And for a second, I wished I could disappear. But something inside me didn't disappear. It sparked, small, quiet at first, like a candle flame in the dark. That word pig wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration, a mistake, a crack in the armor of the man who thought he could belittle me without consequence. I smiled then, not the timid smile he expected, not the smile of someone hurt, pleading, begging for acceptance. I smiled coldly, a small curl of lips that promised patience. He didn't know yet, but he had just underestimated me in the most catastrophic way. I wasn't the person he thought he was dining next to. I wasn't the powerless woman he had married. I was something else entirely, something he would only realize later. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Drinks poured, laughter echoed, and I kept my composure. I let him continue to believe he was untouchable, that he still controlled the narrative, that he still had power, but I was already planning my move. Quietly, calculated. Every word he had said, every smirk, every glance of condescension, it was fuel. And by the time I revealed who I truly was, it wouldn't just embarrass him, it would be devastating. And he had no idea it was coming. I walked away from that dinner, smiling behind my mask of composure, thinking, they all think I'm invisible. But tonight, everything changes. As I drove home through the quiet streets of North Carolina, the city lights reflected on the windshield like fractured glass. I replayed the moment in my head, over and over, every laugh, every jab, every smirk. And with each repetition, the path forward became clearer. Not angry, not desperate, calculated. I wasn't the woman who needed validation anymore. I was the woman who would reclaim her life. And she would do it quietly, invisibly, with every step perfectly timed. The morning after the office dinner, the house was eerily quiet. The sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of our North Carolina home, warm and forgiving, but it didn't reach the corners where tension had taken residence. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, noting the familiar disarray of our life together. A mug left on the counter, a tie slung over the chair, his cologne lingering faintly in the air. I thought about last night. The word, pig. It burned still, a mark left on my consciousness. And yet, strangely, I felt no tears, no outburst of rage. Just a cold clarity. The kind that comes when the world finally shows you the truth you've been avoiding. He didn't see me. He never had. And now that ignorance would be his undoing. James entered the kitchen, stretching his arms lazily, pretending he hadn't just humiliated me in front of his colleagues. "Morning," he said, casual, almost affectionate, as if last night hadn't happened. I smiled politely, nodding. "Morning." It was the first of many small betrayals I would face, though at the time I didn't realize it. He had always dismissed me, little jabs masked as jokes, subtle criticisms disguised as concern. But last night had made the pattern undeniable. The difference now was that I saw him clearly, and clarity is the first step toward power. Work that morning was a different battlefield. I pored over reports, emails and presentations, everything James claimed he handled so efficiently. I noticed flaws he had overlooked, miscalculations hidden beneath layers of corporate arrogance. It was almost amusing. The man who thought he could belittle me had no idea I had been observing, analyzing, absorbing. Every weakness he displayed was another thread in a web I would one day pull tight. And yet, I couldn't act, at least, not yet. Patience would be the weapon he never anticipated. I glanced at his office from across the floor, watching him laugh at some poor intern's joke. He had no idea the woman he dismissed would soon control everything he held dear. The next few days were a careful dance. I nodded, agreed, and occasionally smiled at his ridiculous remarks, all while plotting the quiet dismantling of his ego. The house, the office, even our mutual friends, they were pieces on a chessboard, and I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. At night, I lay awake, tracing the memory of his words, the sharpness of his insult. Pig. One word, yet it encapsulated the contempt he had for me all along. And I realized, to him, my power, my intelligence, my ambition, none of it mattered. It's strange how someone can show you their true face without meaning to, how humiliation can illuminate what love never could. And in that illumination, I saw the path clearly. I would not fight with anger. I would fight with inevitability. By the end of that week, I began noticing subtle signs that change might be possible. Conversations at the office hinted at upcoming leadership shifts. Mentions of restructuring, of new positions, of someone capable stepping into a role he couldn't handle. He didn't see the threads I was following, but I did. And each thread was a doorway, waiting for me to step through. I started keeping notes, quietly, meticulously, every slight, every condescension, every underestimation. Not for revenge, not yet, but for the moment when the scales would tip, and when that moment came, it would not be loud, it would be undeniable. Late one night, as James bragged about his achievements to a colleague over drinks, I overheard a mention of an executive reshuffle. Something inside me stirred. Could this be the chance I had been waiting for? By the end of the week, I had begun shaping my double life, the obedient, agreeable wife by day, the calculating observer by night. Every interaction became a test, every smile a strategy, every silence a weapon. And as I watched James, so confident in his world, I realized how fragile it all really was. He didn't know the war had already begun. I had always trusted him. Or at least, I thought I had. That night at the office dinner had cracked something fundamental, but the real betrayal came quietly, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of a well-lit room. It started with small inconsistencies. A late-night text he claimed was from a colleague. A phone call he stepped outside to take, saying it was urgent work. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself that suspicion was dangerous, that paranoia could destroy clarity. But instinct is a cruel and precise thing. It whispers the truth when the world tries to hide it. One evening, I returned home earlier than expected. The house was dimly lit, the scent of his cologne heavy in the air. I noticed the faintest hint of perfume, an expensive kind he had never bought for me. My heart stuttered, caught between denial and the icy fingers of suspicion. I moved silently through the house, careful not to make a sound. And then I saw him. Not in the way I expected. Not with a colleague discussing numbers or deadlines. But with someone else, someone I knew, someone I had met at his office functions. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember moving. I only remember the slow, unbearable sinking of my chest, the way the world seemed to tilt, and the realization, trust, once broken, can never be repaired by words alone. I left without confrontation. I walked out into the North Carolina night, letting the cool air press against my face, grounding me. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I planned. Every betrayal, every whispered lie, every casual dismissal, it all became pieces in a pattern I could now see with terrifying clarity. The next days were a study in control. I observed him like a hawk, noting his routines, his vulnerabilities, the ways he thought I was oblivious. Every lie he told, every glance he threw at someone else became a data point, and the deeper I delved, the more I realized. He had never valued me, my intelligence or my ambition. He had only ever seen me as a backdrop. And irony has a way of tasting sweeter when it's served cold. Late one night, I discovered a hidden email thread, details of corporate strategy, personal favors, secret alliances, and in the signature line, a name I never expected to see, someone connected directly to him, working against me even before I knew it. I began piecing together the threads of his life, the manipulations at work, the whispered jokes at parties, the subtle undermining of my career. The betrayal was everywhere, embedded in mundane interactions that now seemed like careful traps, and in each revelation a quiet fury began to grow. Not the wild, screaming rage of the moment, but the slow, deliberate kind that waits for perfect timing. I realized that vengeance would not be loud, it would not be messy, it would be inevitable. Every action I would take from this point forward would be calculated, each move designed to expose him without ever touching him directly, at least, not yet. And as I sat at my desk, reviewing the documents I had gathered, I understood something essential. Betrayal is only devastating if you give it power. I would take his betrayal, his arrogance and his ignorance, and turn it into a weapon he could never anticipate. Then, a casual conversation overheard at the office. He laughed, speaking of an upcoming promotion, one he assumed I was too small to notice. But I noticed, and I realized, I could become the very thing that would overshadow him entirely. I began keeping meticulous notes. Every slight, every lie, every betrayal became data. And in that data, I saw opportunity. I didn't act immediately. I watched. I waited. I learned. And with every passing day, the outline of my plan became sharper, more precise. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was naive. But he had no idea that every misstep, every careless word, every underestimation was building the foundation for his downfall. By the time Thursday arrived, the weight of betrayal had become a living thing in the corners of my home and office. I moved through my days with a dual consciousness, outwardly composed, inwardly analyzing every gesture, every phrase, every shadow of intent from James. He still didn't see me. He still believed the woman he called a pig, and ignored at meetings, was the same woman quietly enduring his arrogance. The thrill of that ignorance was a spark I carried with me, flickering behind my calm exterior. I began noticing patterns not just in him, but in the environment he thought he controlled. Office politics, whispered alliances, subtle favors, the shifting loyalties of colleagues who assumed they had power simply by proximity. And in every pattern, I saw leverage. It started small. Casual mentions at lunch, watching him fumble with presentations, noting who laughed at his jokes out of fear rather than amusement. Each observation, each quiet humiliation he inflicted on others, became fuel, not for revenge yet but for understanding the landscape. The battlefield. At home, the tension was just as potent. James continued his oblivious arrogance, flaunting plans and secrets in front of me as if I were blind. He didn't see the way I watched, the way I listened, the way I catalogued every misstep. And then came the first test of my restraint. A friend of his, someone I had trusted to be neutral, casually mentioned a conversation he had overheard James talking about, a confidential executive meeting. The kind of meeting that could determine promotions, mergers, the very shape of power within the company. He had been careless, laughing, describing plans as though the world revolved around his cleverness. I knew then that timing was everything. To act too soon would ruin the effect. To act too late could let him consolidate power and crush opportunity. Precision, patience, and observation were the only weapons I could rely on. And yet, a part of me ached. Not from betrayal. Not from humiliation, but from the cold necessity of patience. Waiting is lonely, and it's harder when the person who wronged you smiles each morning, oblivious to the storm gathering quietly behind your eyes. One evening, I found a misfiled document on his desk, a financial report that contradicted everything he had claimed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Enough to expose a lie if timed correctly. And I began to imagine how it could unfold. I started mapping his day, his routines, his moments of vulnerability. Office hours, gym sessions, meetings, even the way he drank his coffee at home. Every predictable action became a piece of my strategy. He believed he was untouchable, but control is an illusion, and illusions can be shattered quietly without a word. At the same time, I strengthened my own presence at work. I volunteered for projects he deemed beneath me. I smiled at colleagues, but only to collect information. I let him believe I was distracted by trivialities, while I absorbed the intricate web of alliances and weaknesses surrounding him. Every act, every smile, every nod was calculated, and the irony of it was intoxicating. He believed he had the upper hand. He believed he was untouchable. And all the while he was handing me the tools I would use to dismantle him. One Friday afternoon, a whispered conversation in the office hallway hinted at a major corporate restructuring, something James had not shared, something he clearly assumed I would never discover. My pulse quickened. This was the first true opening. By the end of the week, I had begun a subtle campaign of influence. Suggestions in meetings, minor corrections to flawed reports, hints at overlooked opportunities, all designed to position myself strategically without him suspecting. The deeper I delved, the more I realized something essential. Revenge isn't about emotion. It's about inevitability. Every move I made, every quiet observation, brought me closer to a point where exposing him wouldn't just humiliate, it would reshape the world around him quietly, irreversibly. And he had no idea how close that point was. I thought I had seen the worst of his betrayal. I thought the humiliation at the office dinner and the subtle lies at home were the full measure of his arrogance. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning, deceptively calm, the kind of day that lulls you into a false sense of security. I had arrived at the office early, as I often did, to review the documents I had been quietly collecting, the threads of weakness, the cracks in his empire. But what I discovered that morning shattered more than trust. It shattered the illusion of the life I had built with him. A client file, misfiled or perhaps intentionally hidden, revealed the truth. James had not only been unfaithful in the way I had begun to suspect, but he had been siphoning corporate resources, manipulating contracts, and undermining colleagues in ways that could ruin countless careers. And I had been blind to the full extent, merely skimming the surface. I felt my stomach tighten, not from shock alone but from the bitter, simmering realization. He had played a game with my life and my career, a game in which he thought I was a pawn. Every lie, every condescension, every moment of humiliation, it had been preparation for him to ascend and me to remain invisible. And yet, amidst the heartbreak, a spark ignited. The moment that could have broken me instead forged clarity. I wasn't just a victim, I was a strategist. And he had left his entire hand exposed. I found an internal memo addressed to the board, one I wasn't supposed to see. In it, James openly dismissed my capabilities, calling me irrelevant and unqualified for anything beyond domestic trivialities. The words burned, and yet, they were a weapon waiting for the right hand. I spent the day moving with calculated calm. Meetings passed, colleagues spoke, James boasted. And all the while, I quietly documented every interaction, every lie, every careless reveal. Each moment he assumed I was powerless became another brick in the foundation of his inevitable undoing. At lunch, he mentioned a planned executive presentation, a major meeting that could redefine his career. He spoke casually, unaware that I had already studied the supporting documents, the weaknesses in his arguments, the inconsistencies he had overlooked. I smiled quietly, a mask hiding the storm beneath. The betrayal was not just personal, it was professional, a tangled web of lies and arrogance. And I realized something critical: the higher he climbed, the further he would fall. Later that evening, I overheard him laughing with a colleague about a secret deal, one that could have devastating consequences if exposed. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just opportunity. This was leverage. At home, the atmosphere was fragile. James moved with the arrogance of a man convinced of his untouchability, unaware that I had already begun the first threads of a plan. I remained outwardly calm, engaging in casual conversation, all the while mentally cataloging his vulnerabilities. I thought about revenge not as a rash act but as inevitability. It wasn't about anger, though anger had its place. It wasn't about humiliation, though the idea was deliciously satisfying. It was about restoring balance, reclaiming power, and exposing him in a way that left no doubt about who had control. And I knew the moment of revelation was approaching. That night, as I reviewed every document, every misstep, every careless comment he had made, I realized the gravity of the situation. He had underestimated me in every possible way. He had ignored my intellect, my observation, and my capacity for patience. And in doing so, he had built a trap that only I could see, and I would wait until the timing was perfect. He had betrayed me. He had humiliated me. He had underestimated me. And I would make sure he understood, in the quietest, most devastating way possible, that every move he had made would be turned against him. The morning after the major revelation, I felt a strange emptiness, as if part of me had been pried away and replaced with something sharper, something colder. Betrayal is a peculiar poison. It hurts most not in the moment itself, but in the quiet that follows, when your mind replays every lie, every manipulation, every word of dismissal that once seemed insignificant. I sat in the kitchen, coffee untouched, staring at the sunlight spilling across the table. James moved around the house obliviously, whistling, humming, living as if nothing had changed. The audacity of it made my pulse tighten. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply listened, catalogued, absorbed. Grief and anger were intertwined, but in them I found clarity. The heartbreak wasn't just personal, it was professional, social, psychological. Every slight, every underestimation, every betrayal had left a mark. And I realized, the man I married had never truly been my partner. He had been a rival, one who never realized he was playing against someone far stronger than he imagined. The danger in betrayal, I realized, is that it forces you to confront truths you would rather ignore. That day, I confronted mine. I deserved better. I deserved respect. I deserved power. Later, I discovered a set of emails James had sent to a competitor, emails that undermined my position in the company while simultaneously bolstering his image. My stomach twisted. He was trying to destroy me, subtly, silently. And he didn't know I had seen them. I spent hours at my desk, reviewing every document, every subtle betrayal, every pattern of manipulation. I catalogued them meticulously, knowing that if I acted with patience and precision, the tables could be turned. Anger had sharpened into strategy. Heartbreak had been tempered into resolve. And beneath it all, a quiet satisfaction grew. The man who thought he could destroy me was building the ladder I would use to rise above him. The house itself felt different now. Every room held memories of his arrogance, his disregard. And yet, these same rooms became my laboratory, my strategy center, my quiet command post. Every action I took, from morning routines to casual conversations, became a test, a calculation, a step toward inevitable control. And I realized something crucial. Emotional fallout is dangerous if left unchecked. But when channeled, it is a weapon, a lens through which every detail becomes data, every weakness becomes opportunity, and every insult becomes fuel. That evening, a chance encounter with a colleague revealed that James had been planning a promotion for someone else, someone he considered more competent than me. My lips curled in a quiet, controlled smile. The game was accelerating, and I was ready. I spent the following nights alone, replaying moments, observing patterns, imagining outcomes. The emotional turbulence had settled into a calm precision. I no longer reacted. I calculated. Every thought, every interaction, every silence became a building block in a strategy that James couldn't anticipate. He had underestimated me at every turn. He had humiliated me publicly, betrayed me privately, and dismissed my intelligence consistently. And yet, the very arrogance that had made him dangerous also made him vulnerable. All I had to do was wait, plan, and act with timing so precise it would be undeniable. And I would. By the end of the week, I had begun mentally orchestrating the first moves of my revenge. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate, methodical, and precise. I was no longer a victim of his lies. I was the architect of his potential undoing. And as I watched him from across the room, smiling confidently, unaware of the storm gathering quietly behind my eyes, I felt a strange exhilaration. The man who thought he could break me had only prepared the stage for his own unraveling. The first step in revenge is always observation. The second is patience. But the third, the most crucial, is discovery. That night, alone in my study, surrounded by papers and files I had quietly collected over weeks, I realized I had enough to make the first move. James had always believed that control was about visibility. If he could project confidence, dominate conversation, and manipulate perception, he could hide incompetence and deception. But visibility can be deceiving. Power is often silent, unseen, operating in shadows where arrogance refuses to look. I discovered a folder on a shared drive he assumed I never accessed. Hidden within were contracts, financial statements, and internal memos, evidence of deals manipulated to his personal advantage, evidence of the very lies that had undermined me, personally and professionally, and most importantly, evidence of his overconfidence, his arrogance, his assumption that I was powerless. I remember holding the folder in my hands, heart racing, pulse steady. The betrayal I had endured had transformed into clarity. Every insult, every dismissal, every lie, everything was now a tool. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine the precise unfolding of consequences, the inevitable exposure of his duplicity. In a quiet moment, I discovered a series of emails from a high-ranking board member, revealing that James had intentionally misrepresented my capabilities to ensure a promotion went to someone else. The audacity stunned me, but the opportunity, it was invaluable. The planning began immediately. I mapped his daily routines, noting where information flowed, where decisions were made, and where his arrogance made him vulnerable. I began envisioning the sequence: minor exposure to test reactions, careful manipulation of perception, strategic revelation to the board, and then, the culmination. I realized revenge isn't about rage, it's about inevitability. And when the moment comes, it must feel like fate. The man who dismissed me, mocked me, and underestimated me would think the world had simply shifted against him. But it wouldn't be fate. It would be me. I began drafting contingency plans, accounting for his allies, his defenses, and even his charm offensive. Every scenario had a counter. Every misstep had a planned exploitation. The elegance of this planning was in its silence. No one would suspect, until it was too late. Late that night, a casual oversight on his part revealed a password-protected folder, a digital archive of personal messages and corporate dealings he thought were secure. The contents hinted at secrets far deeper than I had imagined, and dangerously exploitable. I spent the following days collecting evidence, building dossiers, and quietly observing colleagues for their vulnerabilities. Every interaction James had, every casual boast, every arrogant dismissal became a potential thread I could tug at. I began to see the entire corporate ecosystem as a chessboard, and I was already thinking 5 moves ahead. At home, I maintained composure. I smiled politely, nodded at his jokes, let him bask in his assumed dominance. And all the while, I was quietly assembling the architecture of his eventual undoing. The beauty of planning revenge is that it is both patient and absolute. It cannot be rushed and it cannot be undone. And the more he flaunted his overconfidence, the easier it became. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive dossier: financial missteps, internal memos, misrepresented deals, and personal communications. The pattern was unmistakable. The arrogance that had once blinded him would now be the very tool that revealed his duplicity. And as I looked across the room at James, oblivious to the storm gathering around him, I smiled quietly. The first moves had been planned. The stage was set. And when the moment came, it would feel like destiny, but it would be pure design. The first move is always the quietest. A whisper rather than a shout. A shift rather than a collapse. I knew that testing the waters too early or too loudly would be disastrous. Timing, as always, was everything. I started small. A carefully placed suggestion during a meeting, phrased as curiosity rather than correction. A subtle question to a colleague that nudged them toward my observation rather than his arrogance. Every act was invisible, almost imperceptible, but each planted a seed. Each nudged the narrative in my favor. James noticed nothing. Or, at least, he believed he didn't. That night, he bragged to a friend about a project I had subtly redirected, unaware that my insightful question had guided a key client toward me instead of him. The irony was delicious. Minor victories build confidence both for you and against your target. He felt secure, untouchable, and I remained in plain sight, appearing powerless while quietly gathering influence. During a casual lunch, I overheard a colleague hint at a promotion rumor, one that James believed would go to his favorite ally. I smiled internally. If manipulated correctly, this rumor could fracture his control, even slightly, and I had just the nudge to make it happen. The first turning point came unexpectedly. A client previously aligned with James approached me directly after a minor presentation. "Your insight on that last project was surprisingly helpful," they said. Their tone was polite, professional, but there was admiration there, the kind that carries influence. It was a small victory, almost meaningless in the grand scheme, but psychologically, it mattered. It confirmed that influence could be shifted quietly, and that people noticed even when James assumed they didn't. Every small acknowledgement became leverage. Every subtle act of competence a foothold for the larger plan. And it was in that moment I realized, patience had its reward. Later, I discovered James had unintentionally revealed a weakness in his financial reporting, a minor miscalculation, unnoticed by most but glaring to someone who had been studying patterns for weeks. If timed correctly, it could escalate to a major consequence. At home, I maintained composure, quietly observing James as he bragged about his supposed mastery. The house, once a place of silent humiliation, now felt like a laboratory. I tested reactions, measured ego, calculated influence. Every interaction became a rehearsal for the larger moves I would soon execute. The beauty of minor execution is its invisibility. No one notices the first ripple. They notice only when the wave arrives, and by then, it's unstoppable. And for the first time, I felt that wave beginning. He believed he was untouchable. He believed the power he wielded was absolute. But the first cracks had appeared, subtle yet undeniable. And I had placed them there. Have you ever nudged the pieces in a game without anyone noticing? Subscribe and follow as one woman quietly shifts the balance of power. By the end of the week, I had tested multiple subtle moves, questions, observations, corrections, small redirections, and all had succeeded without drawing attention. James remained confident, secure, arrogant. But each step had quietly positioned me closer to the moment where minor execution would escalate into irreversible impact. The first turning point had arrived. The wave was moving. And the man who underestimated me had no idea how close he was to being swept away. After the first minor victories, the plan shifted. Subtlety alone was no longer sufficient. I needed to escalate, to probe the edges of James's control and see where the cracks were widest. Every interaction, every meeting, every casual conversation became a test, an experiment to measure his arrogance against my growing influence. I began leaving traces of insight, carefully placed, knowing he would notice only if he looked too closely. And he did. His ego made him vulnerable. He commented, joked, or dismissed, giving me information with every word. I cataloged it all. Every reaction was data. Every careless glance, a window into his overconfidence. I had begun testing the boundaries, planting minor suggestions and seeing which colleagues were swayed. Each slight shift confirmed my understanding. Influence is never absolute. It is earned, stolen, or manipulated, and his had been built on perception, not substance. During a routine board meeting, I subtly contradicted one of his assertions, phrased as a question rather than a challenge. A senior executive paused, unsure of whom to trust. I caught his eye. He didn't see it coming, but the ripple had begun. At home, James remained oblivious. He flaunted minor achievements, boasted about deals, and casually underestimated me in front of friends. Each display was a new piece of ammunition, a new opportunity for strategic manipulation. I began to test his responses, planting small seeds that could later grow into irreversible consequences. The thrill of escalation is in its quiet inevitability. I didn't need to shout, to expose, to attack. I only needed to orchestrate, guide, and wait. And the more he assumed control, the more predictable and therefore vulnerable he became. I began subtly influencing decisions, hinting at overlooked details, nudging colleagues toward conclusions I could leverage later. It was delicate work, requiring patience, precision, and perfect timing. Each small move was a rehearsal, a test of the plan's feasibility. Late one afternoon, I discovered a hidden error in one of James's reports, a misstatement that could be devastating if revealed at the right moment. I smiled quietly. The first true test of escalation had arrived. Over the following days, I escalated cautiously but deliberately. A pointed question in a meeting, a carefully placed document, a subtle correction in a report, each designed to measure his reaction, each designed to sow the seeds of doubt. I watched him falter, just slightly, when colleagues began questioning assumptions he had never anticipated would be challenged. The beauty of escalation is that it reveals true character. James's arrogance became his weakness. His overconfidence blinded him to the subtle shifts I orchestrated. And each small crack I created was a pathway for the larger moves to come. By the end of the week, I had successfully shifted perception. Colleagues began noticing small inconsistencies. Minor doubts crept into conversations. And James, still oblivious, believed the changes were random, unintentional, or even the result of his supposed control. The strategy had escalated. The first true vulnerabilities had been exposed. And the man who had thought himself untouchable was closer than ever to facing consequences he could never foresee. I had believed I knew the full extent of James's deception, his arrogance, his manipulations. I had catalogued every misstep, every lie, every vulnerability. I had thought I was in control, but control is an illusion. It came unexpectedly, as most truths do. A routine review of a seemingly minor internal report led me to a hidden ledger, encrypted, misfiled, and purposefully disguised. I pried it open, carefully, my pulse steady, my hands unwavering. And what I discovered made my heart seize, not from fear, but from a potent mixture of disbelief and vindication. James had not only been undermining me personally and professionally, he had been siphoning company resources for personal gain on a scale I had not imagined. Investments diverted, contracts manipulated, profits misrepresented, all documented meticulously, as if he anticipated someone would eventually see. And then the real shock came. Embedded within the ledger were references to actions that implicated more than just him. High-ranking executives, board members I had trusted, even family connections complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in his schemes. The game was far larger than I had anticipated. The web of deceit extended far beyond him. I realized then that my revenge would need to be equally intricate. This wasn't merely about exposing James, it was about unraveling an entire ecosystem built on deception. And the enormity of it thrilled me as much as it terrified me. Among the files, a single line made me pause, a secret agreement signed by James that could destroy his credibility entirely. And worse, it included my name, used as leverage to sideline me in the corporate hierarchy. My pulse quickened. The opportunity was greater than I had imagined. I spent hours reviewing the ledger, cross-referencing, tracing connections. Each revelation was a thread, each thread a potential lever of power. And in those quiet hours, I began plotting a new sequence, a mid-game pivot that would elevate the stakes and guarantee that when I acted, it would be undeniable. The realization was sobering. The man I thought I was simply outmaneuvering was only a part of a much larger network of arrogance, greed, and corruption. And if I miscalculated even slightly, the consequences could be catastrophic, not for me, but for everyone involved. Yet, for the first time, I felt a rush of exhilaration. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. Calculated, inevitable, and devastating. And I knew exactly how I would wield the leverage I had uncovered. That evening, James casually mentioned a new deal in front of colleagues. Unaware that I now held the proof of his manipulation, I smiled quietly. The moment of exposure was approaching, but he had no idea how much was coming. I spent the next days quietly testing reactions, planting subtle suggestions, and observing behavior. Every interaction, every glance, every casual statement became part of a rehearsal. James remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around him. And the knowledge of the ledger's contents gave me a sense of calm, almost cold pleasure. The midpoint revelation had shifted everything. What had started as personal humiliation had grown into a carefully calculated campaign against deceit and arrogance on a corporate scale. And I was ready. The man who dismissed me, mocked me, and underestimated me would soon face consequences far beyond a single insult. And it would all unfold silently, inevitably, beautifully. By the end of the week, I had mapped the full scope of the deception, identified vulnerabilities, and rehearsed sequences of exposure. The midpoint twist had elevated the stakes, sharpened my focus, and confirmed that the carefully orchestrated plan was not just personal revenge, it was a reckoning. And as James continued in his ignorance, I felt a quiet thrill. The pieces were falling into place. The stage was set. And the final act, though still distant, would arrive with perfect inevitability. The moment to act had arrived. For weeks, I had observed, calculated, and planned. Now, the first true moves would be executed not with anger, not with impulsive revenge, but with precision. I began quietly at the office. Meetings that once seemed mundane became stages for influence. A subtle correction here, a pointed suggestion there, each move designed to redirect attention, to build pressure, and to shape perception. The foundation I had carefully laid over weeks was finally being tested. James noticed some of the shifts, but he misread them. He believed minor questioning of his authority was coincidence, perhaps even incompetence on the part of colleagues. He did not see the orchestration behind it, and that blindness would be his undoing. During a client call, I carefully highlighted a discrepancy in one of James's projections. A colleague subtly confirmed it, validating my observation. James fumbled, momentarily rattled, unaware that I had already anticipated every excuse he might make. The ripple began. I began coordinating with select colleagues, those who had become subtly aligned with my perspective, guiding them without appearing manipulative. Each small alliance strengthened the pressure on James, shaping the narrative to highlight flaws he could not conceal. The beauty of execution is in its invisibility. To act loudly is to alert the target. To act subtly is to make them complicit in their own unraveling. And James, with all his arrogance, was doing exactly what I intended. The first turning point of execution was subtle but undeniable. A senior executive asked questions he could not answer. Colleagues began exchanging knowing glances, and I remained calm, composed, almost invisible yet fully in control. Later that afternoon, I discovered that one of James's key allies had inadvertently revealed critical information in an offhand comment. The opportunity for a decisive move was closer than I had imagined. At home, I maintained the calm exterior. James continued his boastful routines, unaware that the first threads of exposure were already unraveling in his professional world. Each casual brag, each careless detail, was another lever I could pull. The turning point of execution was not a single event but a sequence of carefully orchestrated actions. I manipulated perception, guided decisions, and allowed him to misstep, and every misstep was quietly catalogued, transformed into leverage for the next phase. I realized then that the true power of revenge lies not in confrontation, but in inevitability. The target must feel that collapse is a consequence of fate, when in reality, it is entirely your design. By the end of the week, the first phase of execution had succeeded beyond expectation. Colleagues questioned minor inconsistencies, small cracks appeared in James's previously unassailable confidence, and I remained quietly composed. The turning point had arrived. The storm was approaching, subtle yet undeniable. And the man who had dismissed me, underestimated me, and humiliated me was walking directly into a carefully constructed trap he could never foresee. The first domino fell quietly, almost imperceptibly, in a meeting that James had assumed would affirm his dominance. Colleagues began questioning projections, raising inconsistencies he could not immediately explain. Small errors that he had ignored or assumed I had ignored now became undeniable points of scrutiny. I watched from my seat, calm, composed, cataloging reactions. The subtle panic in his expression was brief, but enough to reveal cracks in his armor. Enough to show that even the most confident arrogance can be destabilized when the foundation beneath it shifts. Later, a client expressed hesitation about a key deal James had been counting on, citing discrepancies I had subtly highlighted. The first ripple of consequence became a wave, and the man who had thought himself untouchable was unraveling without realizing it. Each subsequent day brought more dominoes. Missteps in reports, questioning by colleagues, subtle doubts whispered in hallways, all orchestrated, all carefully timed. And yet, I remained invisible, guiding the pattern without drawing attention. The cascading effects of a well-laid plan are most effective when the target is unaware of the architect. James's arrogance was now a liability. He attempted to regain control, but every action he took only further exposed flaws I had anticipated. Friends, allies, and colleagues began to notice inconsistencies, and he stumbled, unable to contain the ripple effects he had once assumed were inconsequential. The domino effect is powerful because it feels accidental to those caught in its path. And as each piece fell, the inevitability of his undoing became clearer not to me, but to everyone around him. By midweek, A senior board member requested an urgent review of James's recent deals. Unbeknownst to him, I had prepared a concise, undeniable summary of every misstep and manipulation. The stage for exposure was set and he had no idea it was coming. At home, I observed him with careful detachment. The man who once called me a pig, who belittled me, and who assumed I lacked power now carried subtle tension in every movement. And yet, he remained oblivious to the extent of the storm building around him. Each casual gesture, each boast, each smug comment was another thread in the web of consequence I had woven. I spent nights reviewing every move, every domino in place, ensuring that when the chain reaction reached its peak, it would be undeniable. The cascade of consequences was no accident, it was inevitability in motion, and I was its architect, and I savored it, quietly, calmly. The storm I had orchestrated was unfolding, and the man who had underestimated me was now powerless to halt it. By the end of the week, the dominoes had shifted irrevocably. James's credibility faltered. Colleagues whispered, clients hesitated, and even casual allies began to doubt his competence. I remained calm, composed, the quiet observer in the eye of the storm. The major consequence had arrived. The domino effect was underway, and the man who had dismissed me, humiliated me, and underestimated me was now a prisoner of the very structure he had built and I had quietly dismantled. The first signs of real breakdown are subtle. A slip of the tongue, a hesitation, a glance that betrays anxiety. James had always hidden behind arrogance, charm, and assumed control, but the cascading dominoes I had orchestrated had begun to crack his carefully constructed facade. I watched quietly, cataloging each moment. Meetings that he had once dominated with confidence now became mine to observe. Colleagues exchanged knowing looks, subtle expressions of doubt that he failed to see. His arrogance, once untouchable, now made him predictable and vulnerable. The personal confrontation didn't begin with words. It began with observation, patience, and subtle orchestration. I allowed him to stumble, to expose weaknesses, to fumble explanations, small, almost invisible cracks that would accumulate into undeniable evidence of failure. During a crucial client meeting, James misrepresented a key project milestone. A colleague corrected him quietly, and his flustered reaction revealed the first real signs of panic. I smiled internally, the unraveling had begun. At home, the atmosphere had changed as well. James carried subtle tension, unaware that I had compiled every error, every misstep, every hidden deception into a quiet dossier. Each interaction he attempted boasting, belittling, or dismissing me was met with my calm observation. And the irony was delicious. He thought his confidence was intact, yet it faltered in ways visible only to me. The personal confrontation was not confrontational in the conventional sense. No shouting. No immediate exposure. Instead, it was composed of quiet, deliberate actions, a raised eyebrow during a lie, a pointed question in a casual conversation, subtle hints that his world was shifting. He began to realize, slowly, that he was losing control and that I had orchestrated it all. That evening he confronted me indirectly, testing boundaries, trying to assert dominance with a casual insult. I responded with nothing but calm silence. The realization in his eyes was instantaneous. He had misjudged me completely. I spent the following days guiding the collapse carefully. Minor exposures, subtle corrections, strategically placed evidence, all directed to maximize psychological impact. Colleagues began questioning him openly, clients hesitated, and James, increasingly frantic, could no longer mask his anxiety. The personal confrontation had reached its peak when he attempted to blame others for mistakes I had subtly highlighted. The room fell silent. His words, once commanding, now sounded hollow, defensive, desperate, and I realized this was the point where arrogance fully collapses into fear. I had orchestrated it. Every misstep, every domino, every subtle nudge had led to this precise moment, and the power shift was complete, quiet but undeniable. By the end of the week, James had fully lost his composure in meetings. The confidence that had once shielded him was gone. Allies whispered, clients hesitated, and his arrogance, his lifelong shield, was now exposed for everyone to see. The personal confrontation had succeeded. He understood, finally, that he had misjudged me, and I remained quietly in control, the architect of his unraveling, ready for the final twist that would cement victory. The storm had been building for weeks, quiet, calculated, almost invisible to everyone but me. But the final twist, the culmination of strategy, patience, and precision was about to unfold. James believed he had weathered every challenge. He thought he had corrected minor mistakes, controlled colleagues, and maintained dominance. But he had underestimated one key fact. I had been waiting, observing, preparing for the moment when every piece would align perfectly. The opportunity came during a board meeting scheduled for a high-stakes review. The room was filled with executives, clients, and stakeholders, all of whom believed they were here to witness the ordinary rhythm of business. James strode in, confident, oblivious, armed with overconfidence as armor. I presented quietly, calmly, almost invisibly. Each slide, each report, each reference subtly highlighted discrepancies and missteps, proof of his arrogance, incompetence, and manipulation. But it wasn't just the content, it was the timing, the sequence, the way every revelation had been orchestrated for maximum impact. As he fumbled to respond, colleagues exchanged knowing glances, clients questioned his credibility, and the ledger, the one I had discovered weeks ago, was subtly referenced in my summary. The first gasps of recognition rippled across the room. The final twist wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no spectacle. Just undeniable evidence, presented calmly and flawlessly. Every move James had made, every misstep he had assumed hidden, was now visible. And as he realized the full scope, the panic was instantaneous but contained, perfectly measured by his lack of foresight. It was poetic. The man who had called me a pig, who belittled me, who assumed I lacked power, now faced the quiet, devastating truth. He had underestimated me completely, and the world around him recognized it, even if he refused to fully admit it. Mid-presentation, a senior board member asked pointed questions that James could not answer. I provided the clarification, subtly emphasizing the facts he had ignored. The room fell silent. The shift was complete. By the end of the meeting, James's authority had crumbled. Colleagues whispered, clients hesitated, and even casual allies began distancing themselves. The web of deceit he had built was exposed, not with anger, but with quiet inevitability. I realized then that the ultimate power of revenge lies in subtlety. The final twist doesn't need fanfare. It doesn't need noise. It only requires precision, timing, and the patience to wait until the moment is undeniable. And in that quiet victory, I felt the full satisfaction of strategy realized. The man who had humiliated me, dismissed me, and underestimated me had fallen not through spectacle, but through the inevitability I had crafted. By the end of the day, James had retreated from the boardroom with the weight of exposure pressing down on him. The network of allies he had counted on faltered. And I, silent, composed, and observant, had achieved what no anger, confrontation, or spectacle could have accomplished: absolute, quiet victory. The final twist had delivered clarity, justice, and empowerment. And I knew, in that moment, that everything I had endured, the humiliation, betrayal, and heartbreak, had been transformed into precision, control, and undeniable power. The storm had passed. The boardroom had quieted, the whispers of disbelief faded into murmurs, and James's presence had diminished into a cautionary shadow. The work of months' observation, planning, execution had reached its conclusion. And yet, the aftermath required careful navigation. Victory is only as lasting as the foundations you build after the collapse. I spent the first days reviewing every detail of the exposure, confirming that every misstep, every revelation, and every domino had landed exactly as intended. The company, once a landscape of deception and arrogance, now reflected clarity, competence, and the quiet influence I had cultivated. Rebuilding power is subtler than destroying it. It is not about loud proclamations or immediate dominance, it is about patience, discretion, and careful positioning. I began consolidating relationships, guiding colleagues gently but firmly, ensuring loyalty and competence aligned under my observation. Every meeting, every decision, every casual interaction became part of a new foundation, a network built on respect and strategic influence. During a one-on-one with a key executive, I learned of lingering doubts about James's decisions that had now become trust in me. The shift was real, undeniable, and quietly consolidating my position at the top. The personal aftermath was equally profound. James, once a figure of dominance and intimidation, had retreated into isolation. Colleagues whispered, allies distanced themselves, and his presence faded not through humiliation alone, but through the inevitability of competence and quiet authority. I watched from a distance, understanding the beauty of control exercised without spectacle. I began taking steps to rebuild the company culture, emphasizing transparency, integrity, and meritocracy. Decisions were no longer influenced by arrogance or manipulation, but by clear, calculated thought and accountability. And through it all, I remained composed, silent, yet unmistakably in control. One day, a client approached me privately, acknowledging the improved clarity and leadership I had brought. It was subtle, almost invisible to James, but it confirmed something critical. Influence once rebuilt quietly becomes unstoppable. The power I had reclaimed was not flashy, nor did it require constant assertion. It existed in quiet competence, in measured observation, and in the inevitability of strategic decisions. I no longer needed to prove myself through confrontation. The results, the subtle respect, and the silent acknowledgement of my authority spoke for themselves. This was the essence of empowerment, not rage, not spectacle, but a measured, calculated presence that reshaped perception, influence, and outcome. And as I watched the company and my own life align under this new equilibrium, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The aftermath had been conquered, not with drama, but with deliberate precision, and the quiet power I now wielded was more profound than any moment of vengeance could ever be. By the end of the week, the company was stabilized. James's presence diminished further. Colleagues looked to me for guidance. Clients trusted the leadership I quietly embodied. And I, once humiliated and underestimated, had rebuilt not only influence but an environment where competence, clarity, and quiet authority prevailed. The aftermath was complete, the storm had passed, and I had emerged not just victorious but empowered, calm, composed, and unmistakably in control. The city lights of North Carolina shimmered outside my office window, quiet and steady, as if nothing had ever changed. And yet, everything had. The man who had belittled me, humiliated me, and assumed I lacked power was now a shadow of his former arrogance. And I had reclaimed not only respect, but control, influence, and quiet authority. Revenge, I had learned, is not about spectacle. It is not about anger or chaos. It is about timing, observation, and inevitability. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment of underestimation had been transformed into strategy. Every small act, every subtle nudge, every calculated move had led to this quiet, absolute victory. The lesson is simple. Power often belongs not to the loudest, but to the most patient. Influence does not require dominance. It requires clarity, foresight, and precision. And when wielded deliberately, it can shift outcomes in ways that feel almost inevitable to those who underestimate it. I thought back to the moment he called me a pig at that office dinner. The sting was sharp then, almost unbearable. But now, it was irrelevant. What mattered was that I had reclaimed agency, transformed humiliation into strategy, and emerged quietly, confidently, in control. I reflected on the emotional journey, the heartbreak, the anger, the frustration, the silent planning, and the patient orchestration. Each stage had shaped me, honed my perception, and strengthened my resolve. And each stage had been necessary for the ultimate outcome, empowerment achieved through quiet mastery, not confrontation. The moral of the story is subtle, almost invisible, like the steps I took to orchestrate it. Never underestimate patience, observation, and deliberate action. Quiet power is more enduring than loud spectacle. Revenge may satisfy the ego, but strategy, composure, and inevitability create lasting authority. As I walked through the office one evening, colleagues greeted me with respect rather than fear, clients sought guidance, and James's absence was palpable yet unspoken. The balance had shifted, and I realized, fully, that true empowerment does not need acknowledgement, it simply exists. Looking back, I understood that everything humiliation, betrayal, secrecy, strategy had been necessary. Each moment had built toward this final equilibrium, where control was no longer a reaction but a quiet, steady presence. I had learned to observe without reacting, to act without rage, and to execute without spectacle. The man who once dismissed me had taught me an invaluable lesson. Power is never given, it is taken. And when it is taken with patience, strategy, and inevitability, it cannot be challenged. Have you ever transformed betrayal into quiet, undeniable power? Subscribe and follow as we witness the ultimate journey from humiliation to empowerment, patience to mastery. I looked at the city skyline again, thinking of the journey, the deception, the planning, the execution, and the ultimate victory. The lesson was clear, the moral undeniable. Power and respect, when reclaimed through quiet precision, are unstoppable. And in that silence, I knew the revenge had been complete, the empowerment absolute, and the victory, quietly mine.